Hello, and thank you for joining this roundtable discussion. I'm Eva Cahill, the editorial assistant here at Oceanographic, and this week we're hosting the last of our 3 special roundtable discussions looking at the Our Ocean Conference. It was a really historic event, the first Our Ocean Conference hosted on the African continent, placing a massive focus on coastal heritage, local fisheries, and the blue economy. And there seemed to be a real genuine momentum and political will behind centering those on the front lines of conservation, like small-scale fishers and coastal communities. And at this latest conference, global leaders also announced 320 new commitments worth $6.4 billion. But history has shown us that there is often a gap between what is decided on in conference halls and what's implemented on the ground in coastal communities across the world. So today I'll be joined by 2 fantastic guests to answer 2 overarching and critical questions following the 11th Our Ocean Conference in Mombasa. What's next? And how do we turn high-level promises into meaningful local action? First, we have Dr. Anna Spaulding, Director of the Adrian Arsh Community-Based Resilience Solutions Initiative at the Smithsonian Institution. Anna is a leading expert on ocean governance, global policy barriers, and what it actually takes to make the 30 by 30 goal a reality. Perfect. Well, thanks for joining me, Anna. And secondly, we also have Shana Mahajan, Seascapes Director for the Western Indian Ocean at WWF. Shana focuses on social dimensions of conservation and how human systems interact with marine ecosystems. As always, if you've got any questions you would like to ask either Anna or Shana, drop them in the chat bar on the right. But just to start things off, I thought now the dust has sort of settled from the conference, I thought we could have some initial reflections on how the momentum and the kind of hive of activity in Kenya has translated. Now returning both to you're in Panama, you're in Washington. How do you feel now the dust has settled? I'll start with you, Anna.
Hi. First of all, thanks for having us. Really excited to have this conversation. I would say the dust is settling. Just landed back home on Saturday, so still adjusting. I would say I was really, really excited at the conference to see the focus on community and communities and people. I've attended these conferences since 2022, and there's sort of a varying, depending on the host, there has been sort of a variation in terms of how we focus on the human dimension or the participation of different communities and different voices. And so I would say it was really wonderful. It was my first time in Kenya, and it was really wonderful to see so many community voices represented, and also in the commitments themselves. So in our space, we work around 30 by 30, and specifically we were working on this idea of closing the implementation gap around 30 by 30. So what do we really need to do that? And one of the key things is, I can share a little bit more about the report later, but one of the key things is about this focus on what I call the connective tissue, is sort of the people, the human dimension. How do we raise the capacities and the development of communities across a range of sectors in order to be able to get to that implementation? And so it was really exciting to be able to launch that report during Our Ocean and to see other people saying very similar comments. So I think the message is coming through.
Nice, that's great to hear. And what about you, Shana?
I think I would just start by echoing what Anna said. I think it was so heartening to see the shift in this focus on communities really front and center. And then for me personally, it was really exciting to see this conference in Kenya. I got my start in marine conservation, learning from the communities and the NGOs who work along the coastlines of Kenya to protect the incredible marine ecosystems there. I think a lot of what we did with many of our partners at the conference was around centering that role of communities. We launched an exciting new facility around channeling finance to communities. We hosted an exhibition that featured a lot of stories and photos by many of the communities that we partner with. We talked a lot about the importance of really community-led solutions for climate change, amongst other things. I think another takeaway from me is just the critical importance of interconnection across sectors. We talked to investors, to community members, to tour operators, and I think it's finally becoming clear that the solutions to the ocean challenges really need to be tightly connected across sectors. And I'll just end by saying I was surprisingly hopeful leaving this conference. I think we live in a tough world today, but it was really great to see that there were not only, verbal commitments, but real demonstrated actions happening at the conference. We launched a new campaign around coral reefs, and I think coral reef and hope are not two words that you often see together. And it was really exciting to see the momentum behind that campaign that's actually showing that there are reefs around the world that do have hope in surviving climate change. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, a really encouraging start to the session. A slightly less, I guess, encouraging question for you, Dr. Anna Spalding. The target is obviously 30% of the ocean being protected by 2030. At the moment, we're approaching 10%, but only 3.5% has high protection. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the community role in bringing that high protection to a greater area of marine protected areas.
That's a really, really great question. And I would say there are so many more tools that we have currently, and that we're starting to really understand and break down into tangible action that can be taken around this. So for instance, OECMs, we're really at the tip of the iceberg in trying to understand what these other effective conservation measures are. So they're area-based targets or area-based tools that have the primary goal is not necessarily biodiversity conservation, but that there is an expectation that that conservation will be a specific outcome. So OECMs being a very specific tool. We also have things that we understand as regenerative seascapes. So areas that when we think about conservation, but also regeneration. So that 30%, and then the third piece I would say to that is that we have the high seas now. With the high seas treaty, I think it's another really encouraging policy tool that can help us get to that 30 by 30. Importantly, I know we all talk about 30 by 30 as the number and the date by which we want to achieve. I, maybe unpopular opinion, but would prefer not to focus so much on the target date, because that really is becoming very, very stressful. I think, and we have 3.5 years to achieve that. But it's more about whether it's effective or not. So to that 3.5% number, that's just one measure based on marine protected areas as a very specific tool. But when we add OECMs, we add regenerative seascapes, we add the high seas, which is a whole other area of ocean that is opened up, and they're very tangible through policy and some very tangible commitments to that. I would say I'm hopeful as well, and this is not something that I usually say, but I was reflecting on the conference on my flight back. I had a long layover in DC, and I was talking to random person in the lounge chatting about it, and I felt the same. I felt really hopeful, because I think that there are so many actions taking place that aren't currently in the metric system, that aren't being measured, that aren't being tracked, but are increasingly getting visibility. And so whether we assign them the title of OECM or assign them the title of locally managed area or indigenous-led area, the action is happening on the ground. There's awareness and an interest in conservation. And so whether we call it conservation per se, or we acknowledge that conservation is complicated and intersectional and it includes concerns of people, I would say we're getting there. And there are other specific tools we can use towards that. So later this year, we're hoping to launch a tool called the OECM Guide, which I think will also speed up the work and the ambition that we're doing towards getting those areas that already exist and getting them recognized, so that the global shared ambition of the 30% can happen faster in this last period, right? If we think it's going to happen at the same speed at which it occurred until now, zero hope. But I'm really hopeful of the recognition of alternative ways to account for things, alternative ways to recognize the role of people and communities in achieving this, whether or not it's recognized in policy. I have some concerns of other external factors that might limit that. But in general, I would say we're heading in the right direction.
Well, again, really encouraging to hear. And there's something I picked up in what you said initially, Shana, about investors kind of becoming more and more a part of this conversation. And I think you often don't necessarily see coastal communities living on the forefront of conservation and these management kind of policies, and people in investment who we often see as quite far removed from that. How was that dynamic interacting at the conference?
Yeah, I think, so if you look at the stats coming out of the summary from the conference, I think the highest number of commitments were actually in the sustainable blue economy theme, which I think for me is really promising, because it shows, again, that there needs to be interconnection between human societies and nature conservation, because we are fundamentally dependent on nature, and conservation will impact whether or not people can continue their way of life, especially in places like the coastline of the Southwest Indian Ocean, where you have such high dependence on marine resources for well-being. This has been a really important theme in our work at WWF, and actually under a project that recently ended across the Southwest Indian Ocean, we partnered with governments in developing their sustainable blue economy plans, recognizing that those blue economy plans really need to be sustainable and inclusive. And at the conference, I was really lucky to open up a session that we hosted on Blue Finance in Action that was really focused on how do you get the right structures and systems in place that bring financing to the ground. And we had a couple of really exciting announcements, such as the one I mentioned in my introduction. It's called the Marine Biodiversity and Community Resilience Facility, and it's a new facility out of Madagascar, hosted by the largest conservation trust fund in Africa. And it's set up with 3 different components that recognize that to get conservation right on the ground, you not only need funding for conservation, you also need funding and technical assistance that can help support the development of more sustainable livelihoods on the ground. And for me, that commitment and announcement was just such a perfect example about how we really need to take a more interconnected approach. And part of what's going to make that program successful is that we're working with the largest commercial bank in Madagascar through a microfinance guarantee that's going to help them actually channel funding to communities and community-based enterprises to help them grow. And we can only do that when we actually work across sectors and figure out what is it that the finance sector needs to be able to invest in coastal solutions. And then what do also community needs to be able to benefit from those possible investments. And we know that in many parts of the world, a lot of the communities and for conservation and also for economic development, they're not necessarily investment ready. That's a term you hear thrown around a lot. So developing that technical capacity is something, again, as Anna was saying before, we need a longer time horizon. We know these things don't happen overnight, and to really build capacity at scale, we need that investment in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of almost like bridge building, not rhetoric, but kind of language are you using? What's the incentive for the people wanting to invest in Madagascan Bank, and how does it benefit the people in the coastal communities? What is that link between?
I think one thing we're trying to show is that there is, and we actually put out a study in the Southwest Indian Ocean region, kind of valuing the natural capital of the entire region. The number's not off the top of my head, but it's quite large, and it shows how important that the economy is for how important the ocean is for the economy. And I think the more we demonstrate the importance of investors actually in supporting the natural ecosystems that underpin what the entire regional economy depends on, be it fisheries or other, it becomes kind of a no-brainer, the need to protect the ocean. I think at a local scale, we're also trying to demonstrate what we call, and these are terms I never imagined myself as a conservation and social scientist using a few years ago, but the bankability of these projects. So the actual ability for, let's say, a community-led aquaculture pond or a beekeeping enterprise to actually absorb private capital and be able to make a profit and then continue to build their business. So that's something that we're really focusing on also as WWF in a program called the SWIO Venture Builder, where we're really focused on ensuring communities have those capacities, partnering with those who actually deliver entrepreneur services to communities to help them grow over time and become successful businesses that actually enhance the health of the ocean and contribute to sustainable management.
Well, again, encouraging. And I think it is something that I've picked up on, is the rhetoric around the investment kind of being a worthwhile choice in the blue economy, which is a really exciting sort of swing, that it's not just worthwhile because you intrinsically value the nature, then the communities that live there, but also it can persuade people who are just after the monetary gain, which is, you need the money from somewhere. So yeah. Coming to you, Anna, I'm interested in the High Seas Treaty. Obviously, that came into force in January, and the terms are kind of being negotiated at the moment. Given that the most effective MPAs seem to come from a community deeply invested in keeping their local livelihood and their local coastal areas alive and thriving, how do we ensure when we're creating MPAs that are further out at sea, how do we ensure that they are effectively governed and actually protected rather than just paper parks?
Asking all the hard questions. This is a really good one. And so, first of all, I have to say I love the fact that we have two marine social scientists on the call, which is really amazing, and not the norm. So also a social scientist, and when I think about these questions in the high seas, I mean, even for MPAs within, exclusive economic zones of nations, I've heard people say, "Oh, that's so far away; it doesn't affect people. It has nothing to do with communities." We know that's not the case, and I think two of the biggest things I think that the High Seas Treaty is going to be very useful for is thinking about the benefits sharing. So understanding that ocean space as a common heritage of mankind, is the technical term, humankind, is going to be very, very important, because it comes up with all the questions of how do we share those benefits, what are the impacts for the global community, not just for those people who live, along the coast. So that's a really important one. And in one of the things that I found really heartening was listening to some of the youth representatives that were on the ground in Kenya at our ocean, speaking from landlocked nations. One of them in particular, this was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. However, they had been working for the past year on BB&J treaty questions about benefit sharing for their nations. That was just really blew my mind. So to me, that speaks to the human component of this, right? It's an important part of our planet that everyone needs to care about. The other part that I think is really important is the issues around human rights. And there are some really great organizations working in the high seas space that are really thinking about what are the implications for human rights related to conservation. So I would say that as these negotiations move forward, it's going to be really a question about design. And I think we know enough, as I said earlier, we're aware enough of the importance of whether it's for benefits sharing, whether it's ensuring human rights, whether it's thinking about migratory species and how coastal communities are affected by whether it's fishing or tourism related to those species that we don't control where they go, that those voices are recognized and heard. And from what I have seen so far, I have hope that is something that's going to be considered as we design these governance structures, especially when we think also about culture and different ways of knowing. I think those voices and our understanding of, say, voyaging, cultural traditions, and recognition of ocean spaces as our ancestors in different cultures, those voices are heard now.
How do you think that dynamic will work? Obviously, there are the ocean is a massive connector, but it connects to different nations in different ways. And the high seas have never been necessarily claimed by one particular country. Or how do we make sure that space is democratic and actually listens to everyone, and resource shares with everyone, and not just dominated by countries that have dominated kind of like international cooperation before?
Again, really, really, really good questions. I would say that an example could be through if we look at the ISA negotiations and conversations and the voices that have been present and active in those spaces. It's through existing experiences around negotiations in the multilateral space that I think are going to be really important for this. It still remains to be seen on whose voice is loudest, but even to the point that Shauna was making earlier about the global finance, and how that conversation is also shifting. Same thing. I would never have thought I would have said, yes, let's talk about the regenerative blue economy and how to unlock finance and include the private sector. But that is precisely the conversation that I think is going to make it so that those voices get heard in the upcoming COP1 negotiations related to the High Seas Treaty.
Yeah. I'm just going to pass it over to you, Shauna, in case you've got anything to add, where you're kind of similar fields, slightly different areas. So do you have anything? Or
I mean, I was just thinking about the point about how do you ensure inclusive voices. And I think one thing that was really promising at the conference was just seeing that there are so many creative ways to do that. I think, specifically related to international treaties, there are many ways, be it through, through art or through like actually showing up and being at the table or through external pressure. And I think we've kind of seen all those play out in action. And I think the combination of all of those will be really important. I think we know that, conservation is always kind of power to be mediated. And that's something I think, again, you've got two social scientists here who think a lot about that, but I think it benefits all of us in the ocean conservation community to remember that, and remember that many of us also do have a lot of power, and some of us don't. And how do we always go into these settings knowing what power do we have? How can we share power? How do we create more space for others? So I think I'll just add that. I think I saw a lot of really creative models on display at our oceans, and I'm excited to see how those play out in some of the policy pathways going forward.
Yeah, no, completely. And kind of zooming in then, I guess, applying those different power dynamics and that way of governing a sort of area or a locally managed area, how do we bring people and conservation together on a local level? Maybe you can speak mainly to the Western Indian Ocean and that kind of area, about how that's successfully done and what that looks like and lessons we can apply going forward.
Yeah, and I think the Western Indian Ocean region is unique in that community conservation has really been central to ocean conservation for decades. Some of the first policies came to be in the late 90s, devolving rights to communities, largely because when more kind of top-down protected areas were implemented, they were rejected. People didn't want them. People were dependent on fish and didn't want some government from above coming in and telling them that they couldn't make a livelihood anymore. And so these co-management frameworks have now, a long history in certain countries in the Western Indian Ocean, but they're still not perfect. And something that I'm part of a group called the Western Indian Ocean Consortium. It includes close to 20 different organizations working across the Western Indian Ocean, supporting the advancement of the Nairobi Convention. And it's become a really powerful way to really bring together broad areas of expertise to drive action towards some of the commitments that countries have made across the region. And one of our big priorities was related to what Anna was talking about earlier, was around the OECM framework. So how do we start to recognize these other effective area-based conservation measures, and particularly in the Western Indian Ocean, community-led areas? So we released a new policy report on pathways for OECMs in the Western Indian Ocean region, where we looked across 10 countries in the region and to try to understand where are they today in terms of their OECM frameworks, but also their policies for recognizing community rights. And I think that the key insight is that there's a lot of great progress on which to build, but there's also some gaps that we can really start working on more systematically together, really strengthening the rights that communities have. We talked a lot about the finance. We actually did a study that just came out a few weeks ago, looking across the Western Indian Ocean at many of the community managed areas, and found that operational capacity is one of the key limiting factors for them to be successfully governed and managed. So getting the rights in place, getting the finance to the ground to fill that gap, and also the capacity. Because another thing that was really interesting in the study, we found that you can declare an area a locally managed area, but after about 6 years, we don't see much improvement in their management and governance capacity. And so there is a clear need both for the longer term financing, but also ensuring that as the threats evolve, that the governance and management systems that are really, very much driven at the local level have the capacity that they need. And that has to come in partnership. And actually after the Our Ocean conference ended, many of us gathered for a final day to explore how to build out this new network that we're calling the Bahari Learning Network. Bahari means ocean in Swahili. And that network is trying to bridge many of the different training institutions and organizations and governments that support community capacity, because we know that is going to be fundamental to ensuring that local management can thrive in the long term.
Yeah, well, that's, again, super exciting. It's really exciting doing this. We've done a couple of these, and it is really exciting to hear how much hope, and almost it seems like where global leadership is slightly slacking a little bit, the local communities are pushing forward and doing their job, really. I guess I feel like I've asked you a few tricky questions, but I do want to know, coming away from the conference, there is so much hope. Where do you see maybe some of the challenges and some of the friction points going forward, and how do you think we can start to push those pressure points forward? I'll go to you, Anna, first, and then come to you, Shana.
Yeah, thanks. Before we get to that, I wanted to highlight, so echoing what Shana just shared, we also just recently released and in partnership with many organizations, including some of the ones that Shana mentioned, a report and it was launched during our oceans. It's basically closing the implementation gap. So it's how do we build capacity for effective marine 30 by 30. So specifically talking about two sort of cross-cutting themes, which are coordination and regional contextualization, I suppose. So really thinking about how do we coordinate among all of these great groups that are working on this capacity development. It's the connective tissue. It's the piece that we don't see. So it's really hard to fund it maybe. So I guess turning that into a challenge, it's the soft skills, all of these pieces that we don't necessarily invest in and that are hard to put into a proposal, into a nicely packaged proposal saying, if we develop education models, or if we do more data integration, or if we do more funding, we're going to see this. It's sort of the social infrastructure that we're trying to build and support. So I think there's a lot of clarity on what is needed, and I'm happy to share the link to some of these reports. As I said, we've organized those opportunities for building capacity around funding, socio-ecological integration. So that's sort of that knowledge piece, data and technology. How do we maintain systems that are durable and understandable for local communities to speak to government agencies? There's also the policy piece. We see such turnover in the people engaged in these conversations. How do we make sure that as new members of, say, the government come in and are engaged with 30 by 30, that they actually know what they're talking about and they're not starting from zero? So those are all, I would say, really hopeful in terms of the acknowledgement and examples like the Mahari Network. But how we get that funded and how we get that supported moving forward, I would say is a bit of a challenge. And so, yeah, I would say it's a bit of a challenge. The main thing I could think about is really thinking about sharing those experiences across regions. So another concept that I do think about a lot when I think about the work that I do is around engaging the tropical majority. And this was a shared publication that we did several years ago, but it basically highlights how there are shared experiences across all the tropical regions of the world. And obviously regional context matters, but also there are shared lessons that we can take from each other. And so as these networks of capacity development emerge in the context of marine conservation, what could Latin America learn from the Western Indian Ocean? How do we, before Kenya, I was in Singapore and thinking, how can we learn from each other from Southeast Asia to Latin America? There are some similarities and some key differences. So I think that building these networks of networks, which sounds really bureaucratic, but I think ultimately the way to learn is from seeing other people that have similar experiences, not necessarily from Latin America and going to DC to learn from NOAA. It's such a different context altogether. So what can we learn from the Western Indian Ocean? How can we share our experiences? But getting the money to get that sharing might be the challenge, I would say.
Yeah, like you said, that's probably like the invisible layer almost, but would actually create such a catalyst for the strength of protection and stuff in these different coastal zones. I'm interested in what kind of lessons were, you said, between Singapore and, was it Indonesia, or the Singapore and somewhere else? What kind of knowledge sharing was there? What kind of similarities were there?
So I would say between Singapore and Latin America, so Southeast Asia and Latin America, many countries in Latin America have achieved their 30% and more. So Panama's at 50%, Costa Rica's at 30%. Questions around there are related to implementation. A lot of that has been led by policy, by governments really pushing forward because of their desire, intent to sort of, achieve this global goal. Whereas in Singapore, what you're seeing is more finance-led. So there's a really interesting structure being built and designed around finance, private finance, philanthropy, and the role of government in pushing that forward that folks in Latin America could definitely learn from. Similarly, across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, you have so much of it is community-led. There's so many coastal dependent communities and people that maybe it's not realistic to expect will achieve, this target of 30% in the way that we understand it to be successful. But there will be other ways through sustainable fisheries, community engagement in ways that are more relevant to those particular communities. Again, something that in Panama, where I'm based specifically, right, we don't have the number of marine resource dependent communities. We're a much smaller country. Our primary economy is, the sector is transportation, logistics. But so there's so much we could learn about how fisheries organize elsewhere. So that's what I mean about what are our strengths and what are our gaps and how can we learn from other places around the region that look more like ours as opposed to the global north, for instance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the same question, slightly negative question to you, Shauna, about the challenges you sort of saw in the landscape of the Our Ocean Conference and kind of how we can address them going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I do just want to echo that point around the underfunding for capacity development. It's such a crucial pillar. Like the key finding from the OECM Pathways report for us was around capacity, finance, and rights. And that's one of the three major pillars. And I've talked to many funders who, for different reasons, say that they don't fund capacity development. And that's something I think we really need to think hard of as a sector. If we are going to actually commit to what we say in terms of inclusive and equitable 30 by 30, then we really need to think about how we invest in capacity long term. I think, I sang a lot of praises for the finance conversations that we've been having, but there were also some real tension points. And I'm not going to get the quote perfectly, but Dorothy Masaki, who was our moderator in the Blue Finance in Action session, said something along the lines of like, I've got my pension in these funds and I want to retire in however many years. And the reality is that a lot of these investment banks are just, they are sitting on the responsibility of delivering for their shareholders, which for many who have the luxury are, it's their life savings. So I think it was a really well said tension point in that there are some major shifts that need to happen in the financial sector, beyond probably the control of the ocean conservation community, that we need to see to actually be able to deliver some of these solutions at scale. But I think, again, I like to turn negative questions into hopeful ones. I think the hope that I see is that, even in that event there was an announcement of a new partnership that's really driving home very novel structures for these kinds of finance partnerships that can deliver resources for conservation. And even just some side chats I was having with colleagues about reimagining what cooperatives could look like on the community level for different types of blue sustainable enterprises. Like, I think there is a lot of creativity that we can build from the ground up that really challenge some of the dominant finance models that govern our world today. And I think we should be ambitious in trying to explore what those can be and creative in figuring out what it takes to put those into practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, both of you are so positive and hopeful. It's great telling the challenges. I mean, that's probably why you're so great at your jobs, right? But I'm very conscious of time and don't want to keep you for too long. So I thought I'd end on kind of a more personal question. If you can cast your mind back into Mombasa, was there a particular conversation or person you met that sparked something new in you or made you feel different and hopeful about the future of ocean conservation and the legacy of this conference going forward? I know that's probably so hard to remember specific moments, but I feel like for people who aren't there, it's great to have those sort of like images in your mind. Anna, if I come to you first.
Yeah, I would say the power of partnerships and collaboration and conservation. There were doubts in my mind about traveling. We all have so much happening and so much going on. And I would say that the main takeaway that I took out of this conference is that people matter and partnerships matter. And so being in place, talking to folks, finding alignment with interests and shared goals is what inspires me to keep doing this kind of work. And it was very, very present there. The opportunity to just stop and chat with people and find alignment and see that we're talking and thinking about similar things is both validation and strengthens our own community, which is going to strengthen our inner resilience in doing this very challenging work.
That's great to hear. And to you, Shauna.
So it wasn't a particular conversation that I had, but we put on this photography exhibition called Our Source of Life, where we used a participatory method called Photo Voice to hear stories from the communities that we partner with and bring them to the center of this big global event. It had stories from across the 5 countries where WWF has partnered for many years. And one of my colleagues who helped lead the Kenyan chapter of that exhibition told me that a gentleman came up to him and said, I'm in that photo. Can I have that photo? And I think for me, it was, that was what we were trying to achieve, creating space where communities who are on the front line of conservation to actually be part of this conversation and to actually hear that, that person who is, over there doing the mangrove monitoring, who is so much a part of the solution in this region was here and having those conversations for me was success. And I think that's why I was so hopeful coming out of this, seeing so many examples like that. And to echo Anna, I think, partnership, seeing the diversity of actors show up and speaking to one another, and bridging the language between finance, capacity, community, and the willingness to do that, I think was quite unique.
Well, it's made me feel really hopeful, and I've loved speaking to you two both about it, and about the importance of these small communities who are playing an outsized role in securing the future of our ocean and the partnerships we're getting across the ocean sphere from that. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights. It's been really, really lovely. And thank you to everyone who's listened in. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure to check out the rest of what Oceanographic has to offer. We've got podcasts, daily news, features from far-flung places in the ocean, and live events. So head to Oceanographic to check those out. And if you enjoyed this discussion, come back next Tuesday at the same link at the same time for more interesting conversations like these. But thank you again, Anna and Shana, for the conversation. It was really interesting. And hope you have a great rest of your days, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
See you.
Bye.